Tonight at 10, yet more pressure for the NHS in England, with the worst ever waiting times in accident and emergency. The latest figures show a record number of patients spent more than 4 hours in A&E in December, and leaked figures suggest that January's performance was even worse.
It's really not a great patient experience for many of our patients who use our services, and that's what the staff tell me as well.
But NHS managers also say that staff are working flat out to provide a good service, and the vast majority of patients are being seen and treated quickly.
It's not acceptable, and it's not what we want. We have planned more this winter than ever before, and that planning has worked in most places. Most hospitals have managed to cope, but some places are under intense pressure.
We'll be examining the latest figures, and we'll be taking a look at the system in Germany, where spending on health is the highest in the European Union. Also tonight, the scheme to bring child refugees to Britain from Europe is being scrapped by ministers, and the Archbishop of Canterbury says he's saddened and shocked. A vigorous welcome in the Oval Office for the new Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the most controversial of the President's appointments.
Honourable President
of the NCOP.
Honourable President, please take your seat.
Chaotic scenes in the South African Parliament as President Zuma is accused of promoting rampant corruption. And we talk to the British sprinter who competed in Rio, who's now hoping to rebuild his running career after a road accident.
In the south, the effect of bird flu on business. Some restrictions are lifted, but other poultry farmers say they are losing money. And doctors from around the world gather in the south to learn pioneering techniques in keyhole liver surgery.
Good evening. Record numbers of patients spent more than 4 hours in accident and emergency units in England in January, according to figures leaked to the BBC. During a difficult winter for the NHS, January seems to be the worst performing month in the past 13 years. The figures also suggest that record numbers of people waited longer than 12 hours for a hospital bed once they'd been seen. The Doctors' Union, the BMA, has accused the government of failing to grasp the seriousness of the situation. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, has the story.
This way, young man.
Scenes like this on BBC News this week have highlighted the immense strain being felt across the NHS. Here at Royal Blackburn Hospital, rated as good by inspectors, some patients waited up to 13 hours in A&E. Some had to sit on the floor. Official figures have confirmed it was the worst December for waits since modern records began. Today at Hillingdon Hospital in West London, things were a bit calmer, but managers confirm they've been stretched to the limits.
It's been fairly relentless in terms of November, December through January. I'm confident that the safety of our patients is being maintained at a high quality, but it's really not a great patient experience.
In December in England, 86.2% of patients were treated or assessed in A&E within 4 hours, the lowest since records began in 2004. That was below Scotland, where 92.6% of patients were dealt with in that time. In Wales, the figure was 81%, and the percentage in Northern Ireland was just under 70, all below the 95% benchmark. In England, the number of patients stuck on trolleys or chairs for more than 4 hours before a bed could be found was nearly 61,800, up 47% over the year.
It has been a steep climb this year, but the thing that has changed the most has been not the 2 or 3% increase in demand, but it's the 40% increase in the delays in moving patients, helping them get back to their homes and back into the community.
With the A&E target being so badly missed, there's now a debate about whether it should be dropped or amended.
There's a certain art in setting the bar at the right level. The fact is the NHS has been meeting, for example, the 4-hour target for many years. It's only recently that it started to go wrong. So I think we need to examine the reasons why it's going wrong and sort those out.
Many hospitals like this one are running at 95% of capacity. That means they're nearly full. So with more emergency cases coming in and difficulties discharging some patients back into the community, some of those needing surgery are having to wait longer. Even cancer patients like Martin are affected by delays. Until this year, that's been very rare, as hospitals prioritise cancer treatment even during the busiest weeks of winter. His operation was cancelled minutes before it was due to take place. He's now had the surgery, but he says it was a distressing experience.
Very anxious to go through all that again, because I don't wish it on anyone. It's a horrible feeling. Your mind in that is going on overtime, and really is. It's just very draining.
December's A&E performance figures in England were poor, but NHS documents leaked to the BBC suggest they were even worse in January. It's clear hospital staff are working at full stretch. Winter is far from over, and the intense pressure seems unlikely to ease in a hurry. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, this week has brought many calls from staff and patients for more spending on the NHS. But some experts insist that the current problems are not being caused solely by financial factors. Bronwyn Jeffries has been to Germany, where spending on health is the highest in the European Union. She's been to see how the system works there.
Doctors on their ward round. They never worry about a lack of beds. Germany has almost 3 times as many as the UK.
One day after the operation, I can walk.
For George, that means almost no waiting. He's just had a hip replacement. In England, patients wait several months. For George, it's been just a few weeks since the decision was made.
The doctor said to me, I have to decide when I want to take the operation, and normally it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get a date for operation.
Hello, Herr Thoma. All of this paid for by health insurance, 14% of George's salary, split between him and his employer. Germany's health system is convenient but expensive.
Hallo, heute haben wir Begleitung.
And that worries doctors like Martin Wetzel. So in order to save money in the long term, they're putting more effort now and more time with patients into convincing them to stay healthy.
It's a lot of time to convince him to try another way. That it would be better to lose 10 kilograms of weight to solve the problem with his diabetes or hypertonus instead of taking pills.
Do you have the time now under this new system?
Yeah.
Doctors here in the Black Forest have been given a financial incentive to make patients healthier overall by joining up care. Many parts of the NHS are trying to do the same. Here, there are cheaper gym sessions, cooking lessons, a music group. It's subsidised by health insurance and it's saving money. As a result, they're spending 6% less on looking after patients. So I asked the health manager running it all, why isn't the rest of Germany worried about cost?
Yeah, the economy runs so well in Germany, so the social health institutions and the insurance funds have no problems. But everybody knows it is just a question of time. It may result in 5 years or it may result in 8 or 10 years, but we will get into a big crisis.
The rolling countryside of Thuringia, hundreds of miles northeast of the Black Forest, villages where there are more old faces than young. There is more money in the German system, but that doesn't mean there aren't problems. Here in what they call Germany's Green Heart, they have a terrible shortage of GPs. And it's because of that that they're finally beginning to really change the way they work.
Und da habe ich Antibiotika gekriegt.
Many doctors still work alone in Germany, but here they're having to use nurses more to help GPs provide home visits to all their elderly patients.
They don't have relatives, and so doctors have to make home visits, and there's often not enough time a day to do that. That's why we enabled a few years ago nurses to make home visits.
Das Laufen ist immer schlecht, gell?
Ja.
A visit from the nurse keeps these older patients well. Germany's population is one of the fastest ageing in the world. They have the money now to make the changes needed in the future. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News, Thuringia.
And just to tell you that tomorrow on BBC News, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, will be responding to the issues raised by our coverage all of this week on the state of the NHS. That'll be an interview that'll run during most of the day tomorrow. And by the way, more details online on bbc.co.uk/health, our website there with all the links for you. Now, ministers have been forced to defend their decision to abandon a scheme to bring vulnerable refugee children to Britain from Europe. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, said the project, which was devised by the Labour peer, Lord Dubs, risked encouraging people traffickers, which is why it would close next month, having already brought in 350 young people. Campaigners had hoped to bring in some 3,000. Labour said the decision was shameful. The Archbishop of Canterbury said he was saddened and shocked by the decision. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has more details.
Stranded at a hostel in Athens, this 17-year-old Afghan refugee is travelling alone. He wants to come to Britain and was being helped by the charity Safe Passage. But the government scheme to assist unaccompanied child refugees in Europe with no family in the UK, which has taken 200 so far, will now only take 150 more. He could be stuck.
If I stuck here, so it's really hard to me to achieve my aims, to achieve my goals, because here there is no a perfect school, a perfect college for the refugees.
200 boys and girls wave a greeting to England.
It was the Kindertransport that saved thousands of Jewish children from the Nazis that inspired those who persuaded the government last year to take in more of today's child refugees crossing Europe. It's a comparison ministers think is unfair.
Well, I'm a refugee, and I came to England at the age of 6.
Among those saved in the 30s was Lord Dubs, who led the push to get the law passed. This afternoon he told me the government had broken its promises.
When there is something that calls on humanitarian action, and when, as I believe, the majority of British people support that humanitarian action, I think the government are behaving very shamefully by saying, no, we don't want any more of this. I think it's disappointing and it's shabby, and I don't think they should have done it.
Those who want to help more child refugees, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, said today that the government was going back on commitments it made last year. But ministers say to that there's no point in inviting thousands of children here if the local councils who'll have to look after them can't cope.
These are children who need looking after over a period. When we accept them here, it is not job done. It is making sure that we work with local authorities, that we have the right safeguarding in place.
Called to the Commons to defend her decision, the Home Secretary even found opposition from a few in her own party. But councils warned that caring for refugee children is expensive.
Costs on average £50,000 to support a child in the UK care system, and every unaccompanied refugee child is entitled to exactly the same care and support as a child from the UK. We need to make sure that where those costs are arising, they're properly and fully funded.
There are tens of thousands of refugee children still in limbo in Europe, but ministers prefer schemes that take children who are even more vulnerable from camps near to Syria. And the Home Office said that in all, 8,000 children were given refuge of some sort in the UK last year. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
Now, Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court has described the president's attacks on the judiciary as demoralising and disheartening. The comments by Neil Gorsuch were made in a private conversation with a Democratic senator, but later confirmed by the judge's office. And during the day, one of the president's most controversial cabinet nominees, Jeff Sessions, was sworn in as Attorney General. Our North America editor, John Sopel, has the latest.
Of the office upon which I'm about to enter.
It hasn't been neat, it hasn't been easy, but Senator Jeff Sessions, a hugely controversial choice over an allegedly racist past, has finally won approval to be Donald Trump's Attorney General. And it's clear that he and the President are on the same page.
We have an increased threat since I was United States Attorney from terrorism, Mr. President. You've spoken firmly on that. You've led this nation to say we're going to respond effectively to the threat of terrorism, and you can count on your Department of Justice to do so in an effective way.
But Donald Trump's plan to ban migrants from 7 mainly Muslim countries isn't going to be decided by the Justice Department. It's going to end up here at the Supreme Court. And his recent denunciation of federal judges involved in that case is doing him no favours. Astonishingly, even his pick for the Supreme Court has called the move disheartening and demoralising.
Judge Gorsuch, who's been touring Capitol Hill offices to win support for his nomination, wouldn't express those reservations on camera, though he did reveal them in a series of private meetings. A Democratic Senator, Richard Blumenthal, made the judge's unhappiness public after their face-to-face, bringing this back and forth between the president and the senator.
You misrepresented his comments totally.
I asked you what your thoughts were, sir.
His comments were misrepresented, and what you should do is ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record that didn't exist after years of saying it did. So ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record. He misrepresented that just like he misrepresented Judge Gorsuch. Thank you all very much.
There's no question that Judge Gorsuch said that these attacks on the judiciary are disheartening and demoralizing. Needn't believe me, there were White House staff in the room, and his own spokesman confirmed afterward what he said.
The judiciary and executive are 2 separate branches of government that are meant to keep their distance. Judge Gorsuch, when he was unveiled at the White House last week, seemed determined to do that quite literally, though it seems to be something the president is struggling to accept. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, President Trump is continuing to defend his travel ban against 7 mainly Muslim countries as the courts consider its legality. Mr. Trump is claiming that American public opinion is strongly in his favour. He made immigration one of his main campaign themes, of course, and one of the states where Mr. Trump gained particular support was Montana. Our correspondent Ali Makboul has been there to find out what people make of the argument over travel and immigration.
Beautiful alpine Montana is the size of Germany. It's got a population of just 1 million, but fewer than 20 refugee families have been resettled in the entire state since the mid-90s. And yet this is where some of the strongest views against immigration can be found.
I believe that what we've seen with our president is phenomenal performance so far. Come on, kids.
This is a man who couldn't be happier he voted for Donald Trump. Hollis Poe is heavily involved in local politics and he's a preacher. His Christian compassion, though, does not extend to those he feels are a threat to his way of life.
There you go, kids. That'll keep you warm. If they come among us and then try to enact something, say, Sharia law.
Who is trying to do that?
If groups of radical Islamic people begin to show up who will eventually attempt to harm our women, those militant people need to understand that the women of Montana are armed.
Anybody here angry?
Hollis says those who are protesting against Donald Trump's immigration policies do not represent the real America. Well, this is a local rally in support of refugees. Not a bad turnout for a weekday lunchtime in the snow, perhaps, but these are certainly not the loudest voices on this issue in Montana right now. The state has one of the most high-profile anti-immigrant campaigns, and before the election had one of the biggest anti-refugee protests in the country. The anger for many is directed mainly at Muslims, something local politicians are tapping into, some would say even fueling. After days of debate, the state Senate has just passed a bill to say Sharia law can't be applied in Montana. Shashu Tesse and her family arrived here just a couple of months ago.
Okay.
They fled Eritrea with no choice about where the UN would send them. After more than 4 years of vetting, they landed in Montana. Nervous, shy about talking on camera, adjusting to a different world and to this storm of anti-immigrant sentiment. But as far as many here and across America are concerned, there is simply no room for new immigrants to whom the door should be firmly shut. Aleem Maqbool, BBC News, Montana.
There were chaotic scenes in the South African Parliament as President Jacob Zuma tried to deliver his annual State of the Nation address. Opposition MPs called the president a scoundrel and rotten to the core because of corruption allegations. The president ordered the deployment of troops around the Parliament building to try to deal with thousands of protesters. Mr. Zuma and his government have faced allegations of corruption for over a decade, as our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding tells us.
The gloom here in Port Elizabeth can feel relentless. It's a rough city, worn down by corruption and neglect, and a revealing place to judge South Africa's future. The failures here are easy to spot. This place has become known as Toilet Valley. The neighbourhood was supposed to house thousands of poor families. Somehow, the toilets got built, but no homes.
And they tell us we're going to get houses in 3 months' time. It's 3 years now.
3 years that you've
Three
had
years
this
with
beautiful
this
toilet that doesn't work.
No beautiful toilet.
And no house.
No house.
No wonder people are losing patience. As the poor struggle here, the powerful are looting with impunity.
It's negligence from those that have been entrusted to deal with the public purse.
And
yes.
more than that, it's corruption.
Well, corruption, it boils down to corruption. You can't run away from it.
It's the same story with these buses, which have sat unused in a depot since they were brought in for the 2010 World Cup. The corruption here is quite breathtaking. This one bus scandal alone has cost the city more than £100 million, and that's just a fraction of what's been lost or stolen here. To many in South Africa, the blame goes all the way to the top, and the example set by President Jacob Zuma, arriving this evening to address Parliament in Cape Town. Tighter security is becoming something of a habit here. Inside, opposition MPs interrupted the president's speech.
An incorrigible man, rotten to the core.
Reminding him that he'd broken his oath of office in relation to a corruption scandal.
In English, he's called a scoundrel.
Eventually, political theatre turned into something more violent. Security guards called in to eject the protesting MPs.
We would like to apologise.
Only then did Mr. Zuma get his chance to celebrate his government's achievements.
We are building a South Africa that must be free from poverty, inequality and unemployment.
But the political mood here is sour and likely to get worse. But as gloomy as things may seem here, there's change in the air. Here in Port Elizabeth and in other key cities, the opposition has been winning power in local elections, nudging South African democracy in the right direction. The result, a frenzy of initiatives in Port Elizabeth. The former opposition now keen to show it can fix the city. And who knows, maybe win power nationwide in 2019. So if you get it right here, is this the way out of trouble for South Africa?
This is the only way out of trouble for South Africa. That is why it is so critical for us to have achieved what we did in the last local government elections. We are steadfast that by 2019 we will put a coalition government together that will govern South Africa, where we bring all people together.
That's a message that has begun to gain momentum.
If they keep on being competent, they don't lose motivation as time goes, then South Africa is set to boom.
To boom?
Yes.
Perhaps. But in Toilet Valley, they're still waiting for homes. South Africa's economy remains stagnant, and the challenges for any party are immense. Andrew Harding, BBC News in Port Elizabeth.
Let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now. 4 men who were part of a gang that sexually exploited teenage girls in Rochdale are facing deportation to Pakistan. The men, they're British nationals of Pakistani origin, were jailed for between 6 and 22 years. Immigration judges have rejected appeals against plans to strip them of their British citizenship. City of Edinburgh Council says it will examine all the recommendations of a report which found that poor quality control was to blame for a wall collapsing at a primary school a year ago. The incident led to the temporary closure of 17 other schools which were built as part of the same private finance agreement. New data from the Department for Transport shows record levels of traffic on Britain's roads. There were over 320 billion vehicle miles travelled last year. This is the most ever recorded. It's 2% more than in the pre-recession peak in the year ending September 2007. 4 of Labour's newest MPs have been promoted to Jeremy Corbyn's front bench. The mini reshuffle was necessary after a number of the shadow cabinet defied the leader's order to support the government's Brexit bill. There are now 14 women in Mr Corbyn's 29-member shadow cabinet. Now, in Egypt, the only centre for treating victims of torture has been closed without warning by the authorities. The security forces of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi are accused of regularly torturing detainees as they try to crush any political dissent. It's an allegation that his government denies. From Cairo, our correspondent Orla Guerin sent this report.
Here in the shadows, in a run-down apartment block, the brutalised found hope. But today, therapists and doctors sat idly outside after police shut down the El Nadim Centre, the only refuge in Egypt for victims of torture. One of the co-founders told us their services are crucial because nowhere is safe.
When it comes to police stations and prisons, the map of torture in the country is the map of the country. All right? There isn't a hamlet, a village, a town, a city where torture does not take place. It is vast, and it is policy.
So this is a countrywide policy?
Absolutely.
That's denied by the authorities, who speak only of isolated cases. But the centre has treated thousands since 1993. Now, for the first time ever, there's no entry. Well, other doors here may soon be closed. More human rights organisations are being targeted. They've been accused of illegally receiving foreign funding, and their assets have been frozen. Campaigners say the aim is very clear: to silence anyone who dares to criticise the regime. But some torture victims continue to speak out, like 21-year-old Mahmoud. Recently, he told us what happened after his arrest in 2014.
I was abused at the checkpoint where I was arrested. Then they transferred me to the police station. I was electrocuted on my private parts. They kicked me with their military boots and hit me with sticks.
Having spent more than 2 years in jail, yesterday Mahmoud was detained again, snatched off the street along with 5 other activists. He says he was blindfolded and interrogated for hours. One of his friends is still missing. Mahmoud used to turn to the Al Nadim Centre for help. Now he and many others have nowhere to go. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Cairo.
There's more pressure on the Football Association tonight, this time from MPs. They've passed a motion of no confidence in its leadership and have called on Parliament to step in and reform the organisation. And while the vote was largely symbolic, ministers have warned that the FA needs to modernise or it might lose millions of pounds in public funding. Now, 2 of Britain's best sprinters, James Ellington and Nigel Levine, were involved in a road accident last month and their injuries were described as career-threatening. They're now back in the UK receiving treatment. One of them, James Ellington, has been discussing what happened and the progress that they're making with our correspondent David Ornstein.
But James Ellington's on a very good bend. James Ellington is one of Britain's finest sprinters, winning gold medals for his country. But today, he's learning to walk again. 3 weeks ago, Ellington was involved in a head-on collision as a passenger on a motorbike during a training camp in Tenerife.
When I was on the floor and there was blood everywhere, and I looked at my leg and my leg was in pieces, and I was like, my head was split open. I lost 6 pints of blood. So I was just kind of laying there just thinking to myself, what the hell is going on? It was like a nightmare.
So this was the x-ray of his right tibia.
Ellington's surgeon described the injuries as career-threatening. He suffered an open fracture of his right leg, a broken left ankle and damage to his pelvis and an eye socket.
The crash was so horrific, I don't think most people would have survived it, to be honest. So when I was laying in hospital bed in Tenerife and I see all my teammates come to visit me and stuff, they look pretty emotional, but I was just saying to them it's cool because I knew that I was lucky to be alive.
2016 was Ellington's best year to date. He competed against the likes of Usain Bolt at the Rio Olympics. 4 years earlier, he auctioned himself on eBay just to fund his journey to the London Games.
What is your outlook for your future as a sprinter?
Being an athlete and determined person, I think this is going to be something that I'm going to want to kind of come back from.
Imagine that, being on the track after what you've been through.
I know, it's crazy. It's crazy, but I believe I can do it, so.
That belief is familiar to Ellington, but success now has a new perspective. David Ornstein, BBC News.
Quick reminder that Newsnight is about to start on BBC Two. Here's Evan.
Tonight we'll be speaking to Britain's top cop, Sir Bernard Hogan Howe. He's been Metropolitan Police Commissioner for over 5 years, but is about to step down so he can give us an honest view of how well the police are doing. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Evan. And just time for me to tell you that in the next few hours, we are expecting the Federal Appeals Court in California to release the judgment on the travel ban ordered by President Trump and to declare whether that's legal or not. That'll be coming up. Full coverage for you online and on the BBC News channel. But here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.